Good afternoon, everyone. If you can find your seats, we will be starting because we have a very nice and packed program. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to PRIO and to this policy seminar and discussion entitled From Shock to Strategic Thinking, What Now for the Aid Sector and a Leading Donor Like Norway. I'm very happy to see so many turning up for this, to address together these important questions at an important moment, at a turning point for the aid sector, broadly speaking. And we look really forward to, with our top-notch panel today, to engage in a constructive and good conversation around these timely questions. My name is Maria Gabrielsen-Jumbert. I'm a senior researcher here at PRIO, and also a lead of the humanitarianism research group here at PRIO. Before I introduce our panelists, and we have some more also joining us afterwards, a couple of words of introduction on the time we are in, this crucial moment we're in. Because we were just discussing now before starting up here, we broadly agree across researchers and practitioners that 2025, the moment we're in now, is a game changer for the aid sector. Also for global governance and international cooperation more broadly. But looking at the aid sector specifically, many donors are cutting back, not only the US, although this current shock is sort of marked by the moment in January where these drastic cuts of US aid were announced, and many other countries are following suit. But this is not the case for everyone. Norway has declared its continued commitment to principled and flexible funding and has so far not made any cutbacks. And we will hear more about this also in this panel. But as the aid sector is now emerging from this collective shock from the end of January, that was followed by a frenzy of readjusting budgets, recalibrating communication around what the purpose of different programs and organizations were, also downsizing and offloading hundreds of staff. This initial shock is now slowly giving way to a broader conversation about how to use this moment as an opportunity to create a better global aid sector. The proposals vary a lot, and that's also why what we hope to hear different contributions to today. But the proposals vary a lot, from a sort of a reformist build back better approaches to a more burn it all down and think completely anew approaches. But also different takes on what this emerging term of a reset of the development aid sector or the humanitarian system as such. But there's also a broad recognition that this is a complex debate. And in this complex debate, we have different questions like localization, for instance, or a better local anchoring of aid. That might be a natural go-to response now, a better drastic shift of power to local actors. But this also presupposes that there's a support to foot the bill for this and support among the public and taxpayers to do this. Sorry. And also, structurally, the aid sector, whereas many have argued that there have been too many jobs in non-field settings and that the sector has grown to be top-heavy, this has also ensured a certain organizational capacity and institutional memory over time. And turning now also to Norway, among the different diplomatic tools on the international arena, international aid is, of course, an important tool in Norway's international diplomacy, and it's what we as researchers discuss as its soft power. But in a world where the humanitarian system has been deemed unfit for purpose and where now everyone agrees that things need to change, what is then the added value of being a donor like Norway? What can Norway's contribution be in this context? And to address these different dilemmas and complex questions, I'm really pleased to have this excellent lineup of speakers to help us tackle some of these questions today. First, we have Erik Abild, Director of the Department for Humanitarian Assistance and Comprehensive Response in NORAD, the Norwegian Development Aid Agency, with previous years of experience from both the Norwegian Refugee Council and the Norwegian Red Cross. We also have Gry Ballestad, Director of Development and Humanitarian Cooperation at Norwegian People's Aid, also with extensive experience from the humanitarian sector, notably from Save the Children. And finally, we also have Øyvind Eggen, founder of Anonyme Byråkrater, or Anonymous Bureaucrats, and Articulert, and also the former head of the Knowledge Bank at NORAD. So extensive experience also following these debates in the development aid sector over these years. And then afterwards, I will be joined by my excellent researcher colleagues who have also engaged extensively in these conversations over these years, who will join us after a first set of questions. But to start with Erik from NORAD. Since the USAID cuts and other countries following suit, Norway is in a position, both financially but also in terms of relative support in the public for international aid, to uphold and maybe even increase its international aid. But at the same time, we can never even close to fill the gap that has now been created. What role do you see for Norway now, and what are the expectations towards Norway that you meet also internationally? But also perhaps to push this a little bit more, what is sort of, in a climate where everyone else is thinking about cuts, what is the relative added value that Norway can contribute with here?
Thank you. Thank you to Prio for gathering us.
Yes.
Is okay?
Yep, it is. It is.
And thank you for all of you engaging. There are many expectations and many big discussions on reform, but 2025, going into 2025, we knew it would be a hard year. And this is all about people. The humanitarian system we've built up and the humanitarian response. It's about people who are starved to death in Sudan, where there's a famine. It's about people who are being buried alive in Myanmar, people in Gaza being besieged and bombed, people being forced to return to Afghanistan, or people being forced to flee from their shanty tents in Congo. And none of these crises are happening because of America or because of the shutdown of USAID. And in all of these crises, Norway's humanitarian partners are saving lives and making a difference. So what is our role? What is our value? One thing we try to do is to keep people at the center of everything, and how we are enabling partners to save lives. So that's also, I think, the questions we at NORAD and encourage that we think about: how can we help? How can we reach the most vulnerable? How can we enable our partners to find solutions to military, political, or bureaucratical hurdles? And how can we put crisis-affected people and their capacity and needs at the center of everything we do? It's a big, complex system, and every context is very unique. But to trying to sort of, there's this word of back to basics, but it's never basic to respond to humanitarian crisis. And the landscape is often very, very complex. What is in common is that there's always a local community, which are there before, during, and after. Many of Norway's humanitarian partners work to strengthen those local communities in places of war or vulnerability. And our job is to support them. It's also a role, we have a role to support international mandated, big, expensive international organizations who keep principles and protection very, very high up on the agenda. And again, going back to the basics, what's the value of Norway? We try to save lives with Norwegian public funding, and we try to use knowledge and evidence base for how we can do that most effectively. And every single human life saved or impacted is a value. And in these times, it also genuinely feels we have a role to play, and we are encouraging the UN to reform and reform radically. But there is also a value to being a consistent partner, upholding principles, saying that these have a value in them of themselves, and to show in practice that Norway is a country that believes in multilateralism. And many points I can make, I'm not sure how the time is going, but also the US is not gone. And the United States of America will likely, and by all signals, continue to be a major humanitarian donor. How and to whom? Very, very unsure. But there's also a role there to continue engaging with them. And although many other very close colleagues and partners of Norway are cutting aid, many are maintaining a quite high level. So although I literally lose sleep over the hundreds of staff and colleagues that Gry maybe have to lose, people who do an important role and have a value to add in the system that ends up supporting vulnerable people. Many things are being lost, but not everything is being lost. And there's a huge value to keep on fighting pretty hard, damn hard to try to maintain what can. So maybe a bit sort of naive and romantic overarching, but it's really worthwhile to stay a principled, engaged humanitarian donor, I think.
Yep. I'm looking forward to following up on some of these things afterwards as well in this juncture between what we want to discuss today, between precisely what should be done differently in the aid sector, broadly speaking, and what is the role of Norway in trying to play, to make a difference there and contribute with its capacity. Over to you, Gry. So the Norwegian People's Aid has, and to also to zoom in perhaps on what you see in your programs and the very real effects of these cuts. The Norwegian People's Aid has always been an organization working very closely with local partners and being attached to a local anchoring of your programs. How do you see that these cuts now and how you have to face them are affecting also the trust that you have built up with local partners over these years? And to which extent is this perhaps this stronger push now to an even stronger local anchoring? To which degree is that something you can make something better out of, or is it only a challenge?
Yes, indeed, this has a huge impact on our partners. And I think it's worth noting also that the US is a big, or was, it still is a big humanitarian donor. But it was also a big supporter of localization. And because they had a presence on the ground in many countries, they were able to fund a lot of local organizations directly. So the impact is huge. And we made a small survey with our own partners after this happened. We initially saw that 40% of our partners had been affected. And when we did another round now, we realized that of 150 partners, they had lost about more than 200 million NOK. And that's just our partners. And of course, these are organizations, many of them, they don't have the kind of reserves that the big international organizations have. They don't have the liquidity. So the impact is very challenging. And many had to cut back on their staff. And they have also had to cut back, of course, on their programming on the ground. Many of these partners that we work with are, they're locally grounded, they're in their communities. And when they're not able to support anymore, they also have an issue of trust, people are shocked, they're disappointed, and this is assistance that goes directly to their survival. So of course, you're breaking down networks of volunteers that's been there for a long time, and it's starting to crumble, and it's challenging in their trust in their local communities. It undermines their legitimacy in a way. So of course, based on this, we have to make very hard choices. One thing is the humanitarian gaps that you see on the ground, real gaps, and very often it's about survival. NPA cannot cover all those gaps, obviously. I mean, we have flexible funding and we're able to get additional funding here in Norway, but there is no way. Like, we have one of our biggest partners in Ukraine, huge humanitarian organization called Convictus. They lost about 40% of their funding. They had to cut dramatically in their staff. There is no way we can cover that, but we can work with them and try to link them to broader networks. Is there somewhere else where their beneficiaries can get support? Things like that. However, it's not just the humanitarian gaps. Many of the these organizations that are getting cuts. One thing is the humanitarian cuts, but many of them also have had support for democracy work, civil society work. These are organizations that are really brave, really challenging their authorities in very dangerous places. And when they are cut, I mean, they're in an even more precarious situation. How are they going to survive? How are they going to continue in this situation? So, I mean, they're trusted at many levels here. These organizations had some kind of a backing. I mean, there are issues with the US, but still they were kind of a strong supporter of civil society and democratization around the world. In Myanmar, for example, losing the backing of the US, it leaves many of these organizations in a very challenging and dangerous situation. And I think, you know, we have to make difficult choices. Which ones do we prioritize? Will they be able to survive at all? How do we now distribute our funding? But I think it's important to remember that these questions need to be asked to the organizations themselves. We can come up with some ideas, and we see that they're very agile. You know, they look at what other opportunities do we have? How can we survive without the funding? How can we continue to work for the rights and continue supporting our communities even in these situations of course.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for touching on this, both of you. I think this idea of back to basics, but also what is here the core of sort of humanitarian emergency response, but also what is that the place of this aid in a broader development aid system, which we'll also tune back to in some of the following interventions. Now, thank you to you, Øyvind Eggen. You have, in different interventions over the last couple of months, voiced concern for Norway's ability to make hard prioritizations. And this will be needed now more than ever. Which such prioritizations are important now, and for the aid sector more broadly, and what role can Norway play in that?
Thank you. First of all, just in the name of transparency, I'm independent now, but also work as consultant for Civita and Caritas Norway. And Caritas is going to give the solution to all this in a few weeks in the report. But just keep that in mind.
Thank you.
But so and also I've been part of this monster in so many positions over the last 20 years. And the fascinating thing is that now we have the only chance in our time to do something with an international system that nobody is happy with. I think as long as I've been around in this field, there has been so much disappointment with the UN system, with the humanitarian system and so on. And now we have the chance to do something with that. But that requires, Norway can have a leading role, primarily because you have been into, because we have political support, we have financial capacity, we can do some more than other things, and we are about the only one. I think it's only Norway and Luxembourg that is not reducing its aid this year, if I'm right. But anyway, that requires Norway to do the only thing that Norway has never done in the field of international aid, namely to do the other half of prioritization, to decide what should be less reduced. Because we have been, for decades, we have been adding on to the budget, and we have ended up with a Norwegian international engagement that can be summed up in Norwegian, alt godt overalt. We are doing a little bit of all the good all over the place. And if we continue doing that, we are going to miss the opportunity we have to do something with the international system established by and for aid and humanitarian assistance, development and humanitarian assistance. And what have been said in media is that I just doubt the Norwegian government and the Norwegian political systems and politicians' ability to do that. And I would strongly encourage or insist that we need to do it. And one of the reasons is that donors like Norway is to a quite large degree to blame for what we do not like with the system today. Always since the 1970s, our history is a good lesson. In the 1970s, the was an organogram of organizations having a UN mandate, sector-wide mandate within different sectors. That was quite good. It was understandable. And already at that time, we started, donors made or financed the mission drift of all those organizations. And after that, we often Norway have added on with giving organizations funding to do things that they were not in their core mandate. We've added on established unit structures, programs, funds, or whatever, to the extent that today there are not hundreds, but thousands of organizational setups that are initiated by donors to solve some type of global crisis or so. And almost none of them have been removed. So they are still around. So what we need to do now is to go back to the basics in terms of the organizational structure, in terms of international cooperation on development and humanitarian assistance. So that's more or less the main point. It's very easy to state, and it's more difficult to do. But I think I have some. I don't want to say much about the end results, because then you have a very different debate. But I think the method will be that you start by narrowing down a lot what aid shall be used for. A very, very few points. And I think going back to basics, extreme poverty, not all types of poverty, humanitarian efforts, and those human rights agendas or issues that nobody else will take on. Minority rights, SHR, and so on. So starting by narrowing down what aid can be used for, and then make a list of all which organizations, international organizations, that shall be used, that shall continue after this crisis. Because aid is going to stay. That's a very good reminder. Aid is going to be there for a long time. I guess Norway should be the ones to make that list of 10 or 20 or 30 international organizations. Shall be the only ones being there in a few years' time. And then it's easy, because then anytime we try to keep funding to them, anytime for all the other organizations, if other donors cut an organization, Norway should not compensate, but Norway should cut the same. So that we should, instead of trying to compensate this or starting first aid, you should use the X and just say that, okay, start the discussion in the board or whatever. Norway is in all these boards. So to say that how can the activities of this organization be put, and the funding be better used elsewhere in another one. So, and start from there. And also the other thing is that the aim should be a leaner international system, but also a more robust local institutions, which are now to a very large extent threatened, and they are the ones to stay, and they're going to be there. So also, if organizations are experiencing budget cuts, Norway should insist that a disproportionately large share of those cuts should be taken to headquarters, unless there is a very good justification for something else. I'm afraid that unless we will end up in Norwegian aid financing more of the headquarters and less of the field activities that matter. These can be more or less made as tangible, objective criteria that Norway could stick to, and say that we are not funding you anymore unless you can show us that the cuts from other donors are being disproportionately taken in the headquarters. So that's more or less a sketch of the method that you can use.
Yeah. I'll follow up right on that question. I'll also give each of you the opportunity to react to that, because what you're touching on now, exactly that, well, there will need to be cuts all over, and you ended by saying, well, primarily this should be at the headquarters, because organizations now are faced with this question of where to cut, and if they are cutting what humanitarian organizations are actually delivering on, so the very concrete food, water, shelter and protection, that comes with huge human costs, of course, but also ends up with having organizations that are even more top-heavy with less actual delivery on the ground. But if you, on the other hand, only cut at the top or in the administration, then you also lose These are also processes that have been valued for other reasons, for the competence, for ensuring quality, traceability, legal compliance, for instance. So you also may lose out on that end. And more concretely, a question that you have also engaged in discussions on is the more specific topic of the measurement of the impact of aid. Measuring the impact of aid is important in and of itself to know if it actually serves its purpose. But it also creates a larger bureaucracy of professionals conducting these assessments and measurements. Now, with less funding around, there may be even more, and with the current, of course, the climate that leads to, there may be even more a pressure to show that the aid that is being given is actually efficient and has an impact. So that pressure may not go away. On the other hand, we may even more have a pressure to use the money that is available to actually be provided to food aid, water, shelter, etc. So how to prioritize in between the actual delivery and the bigger system? That is also there for a reason. I will let you also respond to that, of course, right after. But if we start in your end.
Yeah, I can start. Yeah. I think you are into something. I don't know if it has been measured how much resources goes into measuring, but there's a very large share of these costs. Very large share. So if you can do anything with that, I think we can achieve a lot. And I would question whether you or your assumption that you need to measure to demonstrate to voters or taxpayers or politicians and so on. That has been some form of a saying, and politicians very often talk about that. I'm not sure whether the ordinary taxpayer and voter care that much about measuring. And of course the measuring system we have today, which involves a lot of measurement that you academics disregard as not as interesting anyway, because it doesn't really help us into improving aid. I think we all know we have ended up in some kind of some path that doesn't help anyone here. But I think as I don't know the ways out as long as we believe that we need to measure to convince taxpayers. I'm not sure that we need that. You can see, if you see private NGOs doing fundraising, they use a little bit, they have some very broad measures, 1 million women something, but they tell stories and can share photos and so on. I think politicians and voters could also be satisfied with the same thing, and you need fewer or you need much better research that can give you evidence, but that kind of measurement industry, I don't think it's needed. And I don't know if this is the time, because now there is desperation all over the place. But at least as a part of this kind of refurbishment of the system, I think somehow we need to end up another place than today. And I'm very happy that Eric is going to help us.
Exactly. And I'm sure that can be discussed, because a lot of the cuts are also justified on the basis of the public support there is or not for aid. So, but I appreciate your response. Yes, Erik, what are your thoughts on this?
What are my thoughts? First, I think there are many good thoughts here. And Norway, I'm a public bureaucrat from Norway, so I'm not running policy, which is the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs. But Norway wants a leaner, more people-centered UN system based on international humanitarian law. So Norway's pro-reform. But how do you drive reform like that? Is it people like me sitting in a capital who should design and choose the organizations? Should we tell them where to cut or which ones to cut? This is a very interesting discussion, and people are sitting, analyzing and drawing up matrices. But Norway also has a genuine belief that to reach those who are in the hardest areas, there's strong evidence that giving trust and flexibility to partners delivers results. And I think that should also count in difficult times. So I have no naive idea that the agencies are going to cut in perfect ways. But by providing core supports and trying to stand by your partners when they cut, some of our partners are cutting very, very much. There's also a value that decisions should be taken by the people with the shoes on. Ideally, decisions made closest to the problems as possible. Of course, there are problems here that you protect your own organizations and your job at the headquarters and so forth. But there is a value that maybe international directors in NGOs have a better sense of where to cut than I as a donor. And then just a caveat or whatever on back to basics. Because Norway and many of our like-minded, we think it's very important to prioritize those most in need. That can be translated roughly to back to basics. But Norway is also very worried that a back to basics is sort of a backsliding to some cowboy way of handing out physical aid. Is a fear of losing organizational capacity, focus on protection, but also on lessons learned, and, for example, on integrated programs. And I think maybe there's been a seminar, but in Somalia, super imperfect humanitarian response. Whoa. There's been an interagency evaluation of the response to the famine-like conditions in 2022, 2023, where the evaluation says that tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives were saved, prevented from lost by the humanitarian response. Again, super imperfect, but tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives because of integrated program. It was not chuck of just physical food aid. It was smart, a lot of digital programs with the government. Again, not perfect, but saved hundreds of thousands of lives. There are important lessons to be learned of integrated smart programming with imperfect partners that is also part of saving the most vulnerable lives.
Yep. Thank you. Good summary of, and thank you for the concrete example as well. Yes, Giri, what is your take, also seen from Norwegian People's Aid, on these questions of between cutting also very locally and concretely and in the system more broadly?
No, I was thinking with regards to the cuts, like how do you do the cuts? And you're mentioning, you know, look at where others cut and follow suit. I'm not sure if that's a good idea, because I think a lot of the cuts now are not just cuts, they're political cuts. There are values behind. So, I mean, if you look at the US cuts, they're not just cutting across, there are specific things they're cutting on. So I think, I'm not sure if I agree with that. But of course, obviously, we all have to do. We can't do. I'm not sure if we can do more with less money. I think we have to, in a way, do less with less money, because that's where we're going to end up, because the cuts are quite dramatic. But of course, then you have to really know that what you're spending your money on is the right thing, and that it's not sitting in like capitals around the world. It's actually going out there to those people who need it, and the ones who know how to use it the best, because they're close to where it happens. And I think, as you were saying, we are being measured up and down and in and out. I mean, it's a bit frustrating listening to the radio in the morning, and you have Listhaug saying that all this waste on aid is probably the part of the national budget that's been measured into details. We know much more about how we spend the aid than a lot of other things. So, and we're not really able to fight back, or I'm not sure why. And I think then telling the stories, maybe it's not having the very detailed, extremely expensive audit or evaluation. It is actually being able to really tell the stories, see the longer term impact, and learning within the organizations. So I think that's important. And just if I can add one more thing. Because of course we can. There is an opportunity here for more localized aid, but it's not just gonna happen. I mean, we risk just moving the system that we have now, one step further down, if we're not really willing to do anything about the power relations here. And I think that's So it's not just about cuts. It's about how you do the cuts, where you do the cuts, and who has the power to decide.
To decide about both those cuts and about how that aid is being organized on the ground. Which, we'll be happy to hear also more on how you can concretely organize that on the ground. But with that, and as we have the time we have, thank you so much to the three of you. Now I'll invite my dear and excellent researcher colleagues to take the stage for the 3 seats here, who will help us continue to take these debates forward. We first have Ole Jakob Sending, a research professor at NUPI and head of the Center for Geopolitics. I'll say a little bit more about that right away. We also have Kristin Bergtora Sandvik, research professor here at PRIO and professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Oslo. And Simon Reed Henry, research professor here at PRIO and also honorary professor at the Queen Mary University in London. And I'll say also a little bit about each of your engagements afterwards, but you have all followed both these debates in the broader aid sector and in the humanitarian sector more specifically over these years, and also engaged in the respective policy processes more concretely. So it's great to have you also complement this debate. I'll start with you, Ole Jakob. You led the commission in Norwegian known as the Sending-utvalget, set down by the Norwegian government to assess how Norway can most efficiently finance its international development aid efforts and its efforts to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. That included, notably, recommendations to divide aid into two categories, between poverty reduction and emergency humanitarian aid on the one hand, and funding for global public goods on the other. But also, for instance, that Norwegian authorities should work to stimulate private investments, for instance. How would you either reformulate or formulate the recommendations from your commission in light of the current moment?
Okay, thank you. I think if I were to write the report on my own now, I don't know if my colleagues in that commission would agree, but I think perhaps the most important contribution of that report, in my view, is what comes before this suggestion to have this new categorization of aid in. So long-term development, poverty reduction, that's one category, and including humanitarian relief, and then global public goods is category 2. But before you get there, the principles that allow us to arrive there is basically that you need what we call in the report an investment framework, which establishes very clear criteria for what is it that you want to achieve with the resources that you allocate. Because in development policy today, there is a mixing of very many different goals that you try to achieve with the same allocation of resources. And so with that investment framework, you have very clear criteria, and I do think it's important to measure. I agree, Eivind, that there is some, elements of it going too far. I do agree. But it's important to assess results, not so much actually for legitimating this in the eyes of taxpayers, but in order to achieve best results on the ground in terms of poverty reduction, for example. It also necessitates a long-term focus and working closely with local partners to adjust and improve and so on. So that would be, I think, what I would foreground even more. I also think that when we discuss the consequences of the cuts now for the aid sector in general, including the UN, we should also bring in the World Bank in the discussion. Because we also mentioned that in the report. If you give $1 to the World Bank, $3 come out on the other side because it's a bank. If you give $1 to the UN system, 0.70 or something comes out on the other side. This is not a critique of the UN as such. It's just a statement of the fact that there's a bank, and the World Bank is really good at mobilizing money. Now, the implication, I think, is do you, as a donor, contribute funds to the UN because that's the most effective way of getting money on the ground in a particular country, yes or no? I don't actually think so. Because again, here you're mixing different goals. Norway, for example, they want 1, to reduce poverty, 2, to support multilateralism and a rules-based international order. That's why it's going through the UN. And 3, it offloads administrative burden here in Oslo for managing the funds. Now, clarifying what the ultimate objective is would make this discussion much more easy, I think. So I think that would be my main point. And then finally, on the mobilization of private funding, I think there is much more to explore. I do recognize all the problems and challenges and risks involved. But if the World Bank is able to mobilize for the poorest countries in the way that they are, then of course there are also opportunities for leaning more on private investors, maybe not for the low-income countries, but for low-middle-income countries.
Great, thank you so much, Ole Jakob. We'll continue to move on to the next speaker, which will be Simon on your left. So Simon, in your work on the financing of global public goods, but also in areas such as global health, you have focused on how social policies to stem inequalities are among the most important investments. But how should the aid sector now address both the emergent needs arising, but also the longer-term consequences of these important aid programs that are being cut, but also to include into that, circling back to this question of the push now to for better local anchoring. One of the criticisms against the aid system has also been that it has maybe prevented reform of global and national governance structures. Now, sort of a decade after the commitments to localize aid better, in which can this current crisis now be used as an opportunity now to do both aid better, but also to support local governance better?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. So I think your question is twofold, really. One is what is really the nature of the problem now, and we've heard some examples of that. And the second is, what are the ways forward? What are the ways that we can actually begin to use this moment, as all of us have said, in a sense, to think differently, whether it's in the terms that you and your colleagues have set out, Ole Jakob, whether it's in terms of how we might think this through from the outside, or whether this is what's the role of the existing actors in the system. And I think what that very quickly takes us to is the recognition that this is not simply a Norway problem. This is not simply a UN problem. This is a problem about the system. And for that same reason, it's also not about where has the US, to name the elephant in the room, placed us all today. Because most of these challenges have been here for a long time. As you were pointing out, Øyvind, these are long-term structural challenges. And if we were to sort of try to break those down very simply to ask ourselves, therefore, what are the ways forward, as you wanted to get to, Maria, I think there are three types of problems. The first is a problem of volume. We have had a problem of raising sufficient quantities of finance, not necessarily aid, but of finance for supporting the global agendas we need to support, including poverty reduction, but also including other things like global public goods, response to climate challenges, humanitarian agendas when they fall in that grey area outside of some of traditional ODA's constraints. So there's a problem of volume, and that's intensified hugely over the last few years. The EU cut 2 billion out of its 24 to 27 framework. Germany, France, Sweden have all recently made cuts. The UK from 7% down to 5%, now down to 3%. So everybody is cutting, apart from Norway, thank you. But even if they weren't, we would still be in a problem we were in before, which is of not having sufficient capital in the places where it's needed. And that's a larger problem, and it's where elements like the World Bank, I think, also need to come in. So the real challenge here, from the point of view of volume, is that we don't have enough, and that's because we don't have enough ways of raising the finance that we need. It's not that we don't have the finance, it's that we don't have enough ways of raising it. The second problem is that of the system, of the structure. One of the reasons we don't have enough finance is because the system is organized in a very traditional way, going back to the mid-20th century, through donor agencies, which is primarily, therefore, through a series of donor countries, which is a limited group who, time and again, are the ones that are asked to pay for these various initiatives that, as you rightly say, Øyvind, now lie standing there. The number of FIFs, or financial intermediary funds, at the World Bank that are just lying kind of, empty, or sadly not empty because the money's still in them, but not being used, is growing. So we have a problem of structure in the way the system is currently organized. And then finally, we have a problem not just of quantity, but a problem of quality. The ways in which we use the money and the kind of money we use are too constrained. And I think this is one of the points that your Utvalg tried to point out with its reference to we need to bring in private finance in new ways, and we need to think not just in a handout charitable narrative sense, we need to think in terms of an investment mindset. What money can we put in to the agendas that we need to finance in order to get out the results that we want? There are different ways and different streams of money for different purposes, and that's why we need to think structurally about some of the challenges that we face. So when it comes to things like how do we fund social policies, the question has to be what sorts of policies are there and what are the best tools that we can implement? So I think we have to recognize now and use this moment to say, okay, well, we've had a hammer and we've hit a nail with it. But the problem is wider and we need more in our toolbox to address the problems that we have. Now, that for me is a problem for the system, and it's why the solution is really not so much about what can we do with aid, i.e. money flows, i.e. donor capital. It's about a broader capital stack, and it's a question of what can we do in terms of development cooperation. And here there's actually signs for some degree of positive view looking forward. So the number of donors is increasing. It's no longer just Norway. Middle East powers are coming to the table. Indonesia is coming to the table. There are a number of countries, Malaysia included, that want to join the OECD DAC. So the donor pool is growing, but what we need to do is make sure that that interest is converted into a new development cooperation system, not simply into an old series of flows from top to bottom, because then we'll be in the same problem 15 years down the line. We also have a series of new donors closer to home. So Southern Mediterranean donors, for example, increased in 2022. Their collective, so Spain, I'm talking here about Spain, Greece, Italy, their collective contributions by 22%. So how can we bring those actors to the table in new ways? And I think in asking that question, we get to the beginnings of the solution. And that is we have to work together collaboratively. So we need donor agencies not to think what is the problem of development as we see it, but how can we collaborate and cooperate with other donor actors, with new donors, and with entities like the World Bank in order to make sure that we can redevelop this system from this moment of opportunity, which it is, into a more effective system of financing the things that we need, which includes climate, and it includes the potential next pandemic, and it includes a range of social policies that we can't actually get to at the present with the current system. Now, there are ways of doing this. We have the Seville Financing for Development 4 conference coming up. That may not in itself, it's a negotiated document, come up with the radical change that is needed, but it will give rise to a series of action platforms from which we can begin to build the seeds of a new system. So I think the evidence is, if we can use that term, that everything points to the need for change. So I agree with you completely on that front. But I don't think that we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's huge amounts of lessons, including monitoring, including how we evaluate what we've been doing and how we do it well and better. We take all of that, but we have to move it in the direction of a more cooperative framework that brings in Brazil, that brings in Chile, that brings in South Africa into more of a development framework that is global and therefore able to respond to the global challenges of today. So.
Thank you very much, and for bringing in more notes of hope of more actors contributing. Now the microphone will go back to our colleague Kristin. So you have followed closely debates in the humanitarian sector over the past years, and also engaged in discussions about these big questions about humanitarian system being fit or unfit for purpose. And over the last couple of months, you have also spoken with many in the humanitarian sector about how they see this moment and this opportunity that it has emerged as, even if it wasn't wished for that it would happen in this way. What is emerging from those conversations, and more specifically this idea of the humanitarian reset in a way? How do you see this debate now going forward? And I think you had your hand up for directing to some other things here as well.
Yeah, thank you. Am I on? Yeah.
Yep.
So I think I'm actually just going to start with standing up for populist humanitarianism here. And you know, somebody mentioned a taxpayer, and unless the taxpayer is on board, the Norwegian taxpayer, Eric, won't have any money to give away. So, you know, if you're going to win a battle, you have to fight. If you're going to have a humanitarian space, you're going to have to be willing to define what that humanitarian space is and stand up for it. So over the last 20 years, the humanitarian space has become some sort of extremely bloated smorgasbord with every single mandate and triple nexus and quadruple nexus and whatnot sitting on it. Very over-heavy, top-heavy smorgasbord, right? So, the cuts, I think we'll agree that, it's not fit for purpose, very legitimate demands for change. And this is also shaping the debate internationally. For those of you who sort of have been puzzled by the emergence of this notion of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that was correct, right? Over the last couple of days. These are the new relief operators. They're not just a new way of being contractors in aid. They're possibly undermining and removing the notion of humanitarian space. Right? So you guys are talking about global governance. I would say that we need to think about a lean, basic humanitarian space. And that means critically assessing some of the darlings that we have. Gender, education, child rights. I mean, should all of this be up there? Probably, but really? Right? So I think there are more critical discussions to be had, not only about whether OCHA and IOM should keep existing, but whether, these organizations should be doing all of these things. And this means that Norway, as one of the very much appreciated donors in the field, has a couple of options, right? So I think all of us very often hear that, I'm so glad your country is such a flexible donor. I thought that was a compliment for a long time, and I'm no longer so sure. I think, Norway can choose between being a well-liked donor, stepping up at a time of need, being steady. And frankly, for us, this is maybe the most effective soft power we have at our disposition. So other countries have better soft power. This is what we have, right? So it is important that we keep, being a donor. But the other option is simply, making a couple of decisions, making a ranking, having a, political agenda with aid. And we do have a general election in Norway in this fall. Why shouldn't this be a topic for the general election? Why is this such a technocratic discussion that it's basically off the table publicly? 20 years ago, it wasn't like that. Now it's become, a discussion between us and you. So maybe just have a very clear idea about what Norway would like to see merged, what Norway would like to see leave the humanitarian mandate, how Norway would like to localize not only humanitarian efforts, but also efforts to pay for aid. A lot of countries can pay more also in the global south. I mean, I'm not arguing for bluntness or being unpleasant. But I do think that, having clear demands is a real service to the humanitarian system. And we need to do something to be able to maintain humanitarian space. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kristin. Now I will, by way of a follow-up question, allow each of you also to react to a little bit to the different interventions that have been here. But on sort of following up on your last point here, and it also goes back to this idea of back to basics, we also see this from the US side. Okay, we'll cut out what is all the things that is development aid because, well, it's being criticized for various numbers of reasons. But then also we see a shift there towards focusing, narrowing on humanitarian aid. That's one of the suggestions, I think, is to shift US aid into the US Agency for Humanitarian Aid or Emergency Aid. So what does that signal? Does it signal a positive shift towards focusing on the core of the humanitarian purpose? And back to basics in how you explained it very well, Erik. Or can it also lead to a sort of a misuse or instrumentalization of this idea of humanitarian? So we'll justify these few things under the idea of that being humanitarian, the very basic, but maybe being instrumentalized in different ways. But let me know who wants to go first, reacting either to this question or maybe to commenting on some of the other added interventions we've had. Are you?
You're holding the power.
Exactly. Yes. You can go ahead, Eivind.
I don't know how to respond directly to the question, but kind of it relates to what you have been into, that in terms of I was starting elsewhere in that both of you are talking about or you are reminding us that there are a lot of different challenges, global challenges or humanitarian challenges, for which aid has been used in more or less the same way for decades. And you have used more and more, we have used more and more aid on more and more of those challenges in more or less the same modality. And that is what I think we need to do now. And that's also where I come back to the back to basic things. Let's know what we use traditional aid, grant-like aid for. And I think there are very, very good arguments to use that primarily for extreme poverty and humanitarian causes. And then find a lot of other instruments to finance other things. And of course, I think climate emission reduction, leave that out, finance it in other ways, and so on. So the result, I think we need to do that kind of cleaning up the tools and not thinking about everything as like we had this hammer. And I think that there is a lot to do, and I think on that part we need some creativity, which the sending commission started on. You need to think differently. And you cannot leave that to the system. Because this system today, the international agencies involved, they are not going to invent much new this year. They are doing fundraising. So somebody else needs to do that part. So that's one part, I think. And also, I'd just like to specify a little bit, because, of course, we need measuring. And we need measuring to manage. We need measuring to evaluate the good ways. What we don't need is a lot of measurement that nobody asks for, except that somebody thinks that we need to demonstrate that aid makes a difference to continue having the support from taxpayers. That part of measurement can be left, and then we can keep on and do other things. And this last one to you on, I think we need to, in terms of the political debate, of course, I miss this debate, and we all do, like we would like this to be debated a lot more. But there is a kind of myth that people doubt that aid works and that there is less support for aid. There is much more support. This is opinions quite strong, and also not only in Norway, also in European countries.
But that's not the thing. That's like, how do we do it? Would be a debate.
Exactly, I think so. But also I think that there are so many other things to discuss politically. I think I don't even whether we manage and not. I don't even know if we want to have a lot of people having opinions about how to do things. There's something, but something should be left to the experts. Yeah, but still, there is a quite strong support. There is much more support for aid than for any part of the budget of culture in Norway. About 80% or so will continue as a high aid budget. And there is not a wide opinion that aid doesn't work. What has happened the last 5 or 6 or 10 years or so is that a lot of more people are doubt. They are unsure. I think about 3% or so are claiming agree or strongly agree or the party agree or so to the statement that aid is not effective or something like that. But following the political discourse, a lot more people than previously doubt or are unsure. So they will respond enten-eller in Norwegian on those questions. But we have a strong, and that makes also Norway particular. We have a strong, we have strong support, and Norway has an asset in that we are probably more trust to do things.
No, I agree that relatively speaking, maybe, well, I don't know comparatively to other countries, but relatively speaking, there is a broad support to it. But the debates that we are having now, and these debates are important nevertheless, not necessarily about yes or no to aid, but how it is being done. But Øyvind just said that this change shouldn't come from the sector because it maybe will just rebuild back or fundraise to do what it's set to do. But how do you see it from your perspective? Where should the push for change come from then? And maybe reacting also to some of the other interventions here, speaking of multiple actors, World Bank, also multiple donors also entering the scene here.
Well, ideally, I think sort of the women in Somalia should decide how they're helped. But that also means that every response would be highly, highly contextual. So I do think there's a value to a international system. I also would say that sort of public debate is really, really good. There are bureaucrats who are now sitting doing analysis of which UN agencies. And I think you in this room and researchers, you have a role. Put opinions out, make a debate. That's important. I also think Øyvind is raising many good points also about what we measure. And I'm the guy actually signing these agreements that some of these agencies on the conditions they have to so it hits close to home. And also sendingutvalget, set clear goals, then use data, insight, knowledge, experience to find out how you reach those goals the best. I think that's a very healthy debate to be had. And Norway, we are trying sort of to do several things at the same time. One is to use our voice in the boards. And what we're saying now for the humanitarian reform and the UN reform is that we expect that we try to move from a system of competition towards cooperation, not just coordination, but sort of having more one UN, strengthening the country level. There are downsides with that as well. But Norway is sort of saying we want to try to avoid fragmentation of donor conditionalities and others. So have more shared resources, more pooled, and then more authority and power to UN at country level, less New York. If I was a local organization, I would probably think that the UN guy who looks like me has too much power already. But yeah. Also, we're trying to say that we need to maintain normative power, sort of normative issues, and to prioritize. And final point, then again, back to sort of maybe the idealist, but soft power. Norway is very stated that it's an explicit foreign policy objective to try to help people in need. And we're not doing that out of public good. That's not that's not in our self-interest. We do it because we believe it's the right thing to do. And personally, I believe there's a value to that argument as well. It's just Norwegians believe it's the right thing to do. So that's what we try to do. And I'm part of that chain, trying to do that as effectively as possible. But war, natural disasters, abuse of power is part of human nature and history. And we're trying to make a difference there. So it's not only about our interest or our soft power. It's just because we believe it's the right thing to do.
Yep. Did you want to briefly follow up on something? Since you had the two finger, and then I'll come to you again.
No, I just, this is not monopoly money. So to have democratic anchoring, populations need over time to support humanitarian budgets. The money comes from somewhere, right? So there needs to be sort of political will and interest in making oneself understood, but also having, political objectives with the money used, right? I mean, I think we all agree on the fundamentals, but experts clearly do not always know best. But I also think that long term, we're doing ourselves a disservice, and the humanitarian sector is doing itself a disservice when it disengages with basic sort of grassroots political support.
Thank you. And Giri, to follow up on some of these different questions.
Yes, there are lots to pick from. So I'll start with I think this discussion about Norway as a flexible donor, because being a flexible donor, it's many different things. And there are some really good things about it, and there are some really not so good things about it. From our side, we are very happy with having Norway as a donor because it gives us flexibility down at the ground. When the situation changes, we're actually able to change priorities. And I think that also enables us to be a good partner. If you want to be an equal partner, you have to have some kind of flexibility to have that discussion based on. If you have somebody who tells you what to do and you tell somebody else what to do, there is no real partnership. It's just subcontracting. If you want to have partnerships, there needs to be some flexibility in it as well. So I think that's a very good thing about it. Then there's other things like jumping from one place to another, changing your priorities every time you have a new party elected in government. I mean, there are many flexibilities that are not as great. However, right now, I think Norway is in a very good position. As Eivind was saying, nobody else is not cutting. We can actually go and have discussions in the UN system, not to justify our cuts, but to actually have an opinion about what's the best thing to do. And we are willing to fund it. So I think that gives us really a good position also to discuss from.
Thank you very much. Yes. Would you like to follow up from this and maybe either react to some of these last statements or also into So you took us also through sort of what you get out of the multilateral system and the UN and the role of the funding and the role of the World Bank. But looking back at again this big look at this system between what is being done in the capitals of the headquarters and what is being done more on the ground, how to get more out of the funding that is now left.
Yeah, so I think part of the challenge is that we're now discussing different things.
Yep.
So one is that we're discussing, the future of humanitarianism or humanitarian aid, and the future of aid in general, and the future of the multilateral system. Those are distinct things. And it's not clear to me that we should apply the same criteria to assess what's best to do for both questions. So I think that's important. One challenge that I see is, given the demand out there on the humanitarian side, poverty reduction, climate transition, it's not that unlikely that the long-term development poverty reduction category in the middle will be squeezed, because there is more and more focus on the humanitarian and nexus stuff and climate transition, and there isn't more funding available, there is less funding available, and so it's not that unlikely that that category will just be reduced quite considerably. Now, as to Norway and priorities, it's amazing to me, I think this echoes a little bit what Eivind said, that Norway is acting like it's a hegemonic actor when it comes to aid. That there is no one organization or issue area that Norway does not support. And that's the role of a hegemon, is to be everywhere. I don't think Norway necessarily has to be everywhere. I'll end there.
Yeah. Yes, and I'll let you follow up, Simon. And speaking of this sort of this in between, one thing is going back to basics and the emergent needs, but the other thing is, what are the new needs that will arise by these other in the middle there programs that are being cut out. Yeah, but I'll let you follow up.
No, thanks, Maria.
Simon.
Thanks, and I'll pick up where Ole Jakob left off. And being a researcher, we like to come with answers to questions we weren't given. So I'm gonna give some answers. I absolutely agree. I don't think Norway can be everywhere. I think your hegemon analysis is spot on, actually. But there are some places that Norway should be, and some places where Norway maybe has to be, and there are some places where Norway perhaps is the only thing that can be there. And I think recognizing what that is in the current moment is key. Absolutely, in this kind of discussion, there are many different facets. Sorry, I'll let this end. Yeah. We have not got the capacity to address all of these problems at the same time. But we have got to address some problems, and we have to start some of those right now. And I think the trick is to, in this particular moment, is to say, what is it we can do? And specifically, what is it that Norway can do? And I think one of the things that Norway can do is to sit down with other actors in which it's been involved. And I know already Norway is, NORAD is, and you have conversations with other development agencies. And that's been one of the great things, actually, I think, that Norway has developed over the last few years. So I would say take forward those conversations right now, because somebody has to have them. And somebody's got to come up with some concrete ways forward. Now, there are proposals domestically for how you do that. There are proposals internationally, including my own on global public investment, for how you take that forward in collaboration with other countries. How is it you qualify poverty reduction, ensure that there's humanitarian protection, protect human rights, and at the same time move into these new categories like global public goods, climate change, and so forth, with sufficient resource and firepower that we're not left standing here in 10 years' time with our pants around our ankles. So that's got to be done. And I think the key question right now is not to worry too much about the interconnectedness of all these challenges, but simply to start somewhere. And I think I mentioned it before, FFD4 in Seville is a starting point. Let's use that and let's take it forward. And let's make sure we bring into that, back to Gry's point at the beginning about governance, which I think is key, other voices, not just other countries, but other sectors, civil society, and those that know the situation at different scales, at national scales, local, and internationally. So I think that kind of joined-up conversation is what we really need. And I think all that's waiting is for somebody to really initiate that conversation, because lots of people I know from different spheres, academia, civil society, and other parts of the world, and were we having this conversation in Nairobi, it would look very different. They're all calling for it, but somebody's got to get the ball rolling. So I think that's where I would kind of leave off.
Thank you very much. You can keep it for a little while. I'll say that we'll also would like to hear if you have any questions from our very competent audience as well, also working across different sectors relating to these questions we're bringing up here. But just while you think of that, to mention that you, Simon, also just published a report with NORAD on time for a reset of the development aid system, just on this idea of the idea of a reset that is being discussed a lot now. How do you see that being, the debate being taken forward now?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks also to Gabriel Lund, who's in the audience, who helped with some of the data for that, and thanks to NORAD for the cooperation on it. Yeah, so that report is called "Time for a Reset: Development Cooperation at the Crossroads," and it makes the point that the title. So it's a long report. Just read the title. Development cooperation is at a crossroads, and as I was just saying a moment ago, it needs to be taken forward in a system level way. That's what we lack. And there's plenty of reason for thinking that this can be done. South-South cooperation, which many of you will be familiar with, has grown enormously over recent years, and it's grown in relation to the increase in trade between South-South partners. So that's going to grow, especially now with what's happening. So let's make use, as I said before, of the advantages and the things that are happening that are positive at the moment, and not get too tied up in, although I know it's key and I know jobs are being lost, and that, you know, we have to take that seriously. But there are opportunities, so let's find them, let's put them together, and let's see if we can use them.
Great, thank you so much. I had one hand raised here. And just to remind the audience, as I didn't say initially, that the seminar is streamed and recorded, so you can also rewatch this later on. But please introduce yourself and where you are from.
Shall I just speak with that?
Yeah, there's a microphone behind here.
Yes. Thank you so much for that interesting panel. Nora Ingdal, I'm from Save the Children, International Program Director. I wanted to pick up on your provocative good comment, Kristina. On the international humanitarian space and what's happening to that. And I think you are absolutely spot on that the most harmful, scary things, at least that I've seen in my time, is what is happening now in Gaza with the Gaza Humanitarian Forum, this new plan of actually of just removing the UN from the whole distribution of aid system. So my question to the panel is, and just to say, these regimes are learning from each other, right? And we just heard now the German foreign minister is supporting this plan by Israel, and the US of its Gaza Humanitarian Forum. Look it up if you haven't read about it. But it's a new plan, private companies supported by the Trump administration, of actually replacing the UN and all, So my question to the panel is, what will replace? I mean, how do we protect that humanitarian space, and how are we going? What is going to govern these international, humanitarian spaces? If we remove the UN, international humanitarian law, what's going to govern humanitarian space? I guess is my question to the panel.
Thank you very much. And then we'll take one question from you in the back. And then
Thank you. My name is Björn Amland from Development Today. I thought it was interesting that you raised this question about how well anchored is aid among voters. And I don't really agree with Øyvind about his analysis, because I think it's true that there is wide support for aid, but I don't think it goes very deep. And the reason for that is that it doesn't affect people's daily life in the short run. And there's very little discussion during an election campaign about aid. But we have seen how it's fallen apart in Finland, not least Sweden, and 20 years ago in Denmark. One thing is what's happening in the United States, but that's our neighboring countries. And it can happen here also. So I was just wondering if you could have some reflections about that dilemma.
I have two more questions, but I think, since you are several speakers here, I think I'll go back to you. Who would like to address first maybe the question from Nora? Or in a combination? Yes, great. Thank you. Grab the microphone.
No, because I agree very much with you, Nora. I think what's happening in Gaza it's really a game changer. In a way, it's been a game changer for a while, because it's not that we've just it's not what we see now. it's what we have accepted and how far we let it go without really stopping it. And if it's just because it's Israel or whatever is the justification, but this is going to be copied, of course, in the rest of the world, and it's going to be, or it is already so much harder to carry out humanitarian assistance in a world that's not going to follow any rules. You can just send it out to whoever. There is no system around how you protect those who provide aid, how you protect those who receive aid, and you will get away with whatever you want. So I think I completely agree, and it's very depressive, because where do we go from here?
Yep. Kristin, you also discussed this relief operators idea following on from this.
But, you know, the basic dilemma is that you guys can't have it both ways. You know, you cannot have all your mandates and collaborators piled on top of each other and at the same time have the political world engage in a robust defense of humanitarian space, humanitarian imperatives, and humanitarian principles, right? That sort of classic humanitarian model is a limited model. You know, I mean, I know I sound like the ICRC here, but, you know, I think either you defend humanitarian space or you take the pragmatic road and then you open up for everything else and then you go case by case and see what works or not. But you know, if you want to avoid a world where, you know, hired hands run closed camps across the board, you know, now is the time to really, for also Norway as a donor, to stand up for humanitarian space, even more than it already does.
The question is, yeah, how can Norway stand up for this, Erik?
I think I then refer to Norway's quite strong and principled stances in the International Court of Justice and the case in The Hague. In Norway's very strong, sort of the starting point is the humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law. That being said, what's happening in Gaza and has been happening in Gaza is a watershed moment. So to stand up firmly, I think it's important. But it's also, what's happening in Gaza is not the first time or unique in terms of instrumentalizing human suffering. Controlling of humanitarian aid as a weapon in the political war, used by militaries, hunger used as a weapon, besiegement used as a tactic to pressure groups. So it's extremely brutal. And I could get quite engaged in it. But to your question, what's the alternative? And I think it's a very good point. You can't have it maybe all, but with today's technology, there are ways of giving more direct digital community-based assistance. It's tricky when you combine that with the siege. But there are ways to empower people and communities in need that is not weaponization of aid. For now.
Thank you. And Øyvind, I think you raised your hand as well.
I was just going to say that I do really hope we can focus on this question. You know, unfortunately, this is also the moment where an unprecedented number of aid workers have lost their jobs and might be willing to take up jobs in this new system. So I would like us to talk about this and to sort of critically try to figure out what it means if relief operators are going to sort of become a business model.
Thank you.
I had nothing to add on that particular case, but I think it's just a very good illustration of the fact that we are more or less in a similar place as US has been the last 109 days or so. That so many things are happening at the same time, and we need very carefully and very actively to decide which things or what to really fight for. Which slippery slopes will we not accept? This is obviously one of them, and there are a few others. Some type of red lines or something, and really take that fight till the end. And also knowing that when we do that, a lot of other things is going to happen.
And that's very political, by the way.
It is. But it has very much to do with what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs can prioritize in Norway. They cannot do everything at the same time. On Bjørn's comments on the public support for aid, I think you may very well be right. I may be naive, and we need to learn from what's happening in Sweden and Finland and Denmark, which we once believed were similar to us. Two differences. One is that we are filthy rich. And the other one is that we are not there yet. So the next 2 or 3 years, we can continue. We have some type of asset that other governments do not have.
Thank you. Any further reactions before we take further questions? Yep.
Just to say, fully support on the humanitarian space and the need to protect that. On aid and public political debate, I think we have to be prepared for the fact that there will be significant cuts also in Norway. It would surprise me if that did not happen, given all the other issues that now needs funding and is on the program already for being prioritized.
Thank you. Great. Then I'll take 2 more questions. You in the front, if we have the microphone over here. If you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Diego. They were from the Mexican embassy. And my question is regarding, I think that all of you mentioned the issue that there needs to be a reset or some kind of conversation regarding where aid is going. And of course, you said that Norway is not the only actor, that there needs to be a conversation. So my question is, what are those platforms and those places where you see actually this conversation happening in the coming months? FFD4 has been mentioned as one of those examples, but it would be fascinating to know what you think about it. Should it be OECD, DAC? Should it be the UN? Or what are these places where you see this happening?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. And then we have Katarina in yellow on the other side. Yep. Sorry, yeah, thank you. So first, Katrine, and then we'll gather your question as well.
Thank you. So I'm Katrine Talrås, Senior Researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen. So speaking on Norway's role, you've already said a bit about how Norway and what it can change in terms of changing the system. But you've touched upon the need for a public debate about what to prioritize, either among the public or experts. And Kristin, you mentioned potential things that could be cut. Of course, no one wants to gender, child rights, education, I think you mentioned. And you have also said, I think most of you, that poverty reduction is something to be kept, of course. But could you say a bit more about that? I mean, it's political, but also, if we want to hear it from experts, what should be cut and what should be kept?
Thank you, Katrine. And then we have a final question. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, hello, everybody. My name is Tale Hungnes. I'm International Director of Caritas Norway. As Øyvind mentioned in the beginning, we are working together with Øyvind on a policy brief that will be launched towards the end of May. I'm not sure, Øyvind, if we managed to find a solution to all this, but at least we will launch some proposals with strong focus on localization and strong focus on domestic resource mobilization. The reason why we are doing this is not only because we are interested ourselves, but also because we hear a lot of expectations from our global network and this to Norway as the unique position that Norway has financially, and also with a strong support and strong moral potential moral leadership within this field. So we also have a strong expectation in our global network towards Norway. And my question therefore goes to Erik and Norad and picks up on Gry's point on localization and the fact that USAID was very strong on localization. So for me, representing an international movement of local organizations integrated in their own communities, in my expertise, in my experience, Norway actually puts quite a lot of emphasis of the size of head office in Oslo, the size of competence, capacity in Oslo. So on that background, which role and what is the level of ambition of NORAD? How strong will you be when it comes to localization? And I think the latest month will give a lot of reason to why that should be strengthened.
Thank you very much for all your excellent questions. Maybe we'll start with you, Simon, and going this way back. perhaps to also address the question on the where are these meeting places to address these questions and any of the other questions as well, of course.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. So I think there's two answers to your question. One is what spaces can we potentially create out of what exists, and the other one is what spaces will be used if we don't do that. And I think the better answers come from the former. So the sorts of spaces that we can use. I mean, I think we are at the stage where it's about coalitions of the willing between governments, but also between non-government sectors as well, NGOs, many of who are here, but also civil society. I mean, you mentioned Seville again. Obviously, there are platforms, international frameworks. ECOSOC would be another one. The Development Cooperation Forum. There are formal spaces that already exist where discussions around the nature and future of development cooperation can take place. Those need to be taken forward at a speed where I feel the nature of progress in those fora is too slow. And that's the challenge, because then we have a problem of legitimacy and a problem of efficiency, and those two things are never particularly happy bedfellows. So what we need to do, I think, is draw upon the experience that we have, the reports that are out there and that are coming out, and I look forward to reading yours, Øyvind, when it comes. We need to take that information, we need to leverage the power of networks. So I mentioned global public investment before. I won't say very much about it now because we're in closing questions, but the idea that you can have a network of other organizations, all of whom are pushing on the same front, and your former ambassador here, Ambassador Canchola, has also been a key supporter of some of these progresses. Mexico itself has been a key country in our agenda. Taking forward ideas that seem promising, but that don't necessarily need to be fully worked through. They don't need to be complete policy arrangements that we have done and dusted, organized in capitals, and so we're finished. But they can be co-created and developed and taken forward by those other actors so that there's buy-in. And then you solve the legitimacy problem. And then by doing that in a way that makes the best use of the research that we already have, and the knowledge is there mostly, and the capacity that we have amongst international frameworks and agendas and organizations like NGOs, to take those agendas to the spaces that need to be taken and to advocate for the changes that are needed, whether that's at the G20, so there's a space where you can have efficiency in action, and a lot of the countries that we are talking about today are involved in that space. But then that's got to be taken. So I think the answer to which sorts of spaces is there are several. The question really is, what is our strategy that can link those spaces and the actors that need to come together in them? And that's where I think we need NORAD and we need other partners to lead on this. So providing, as it were, kind of normative leadership without trying to make claims for them being the moral leaders and without trying to make them claims of being the financial leaders or the hegemons in the way that Ole Jakob described.
Thank you very much. Now we have an average of 30 seconds per person left.
Very briefly, my concern is that the most important platform and arenas for discussion are not public ones. They are very closed and with a small group of actors. That's one. The other is that over time, the whole aid system has evolved to feature a very, very large number of different types of consultancies, and they are becoming more and more important, and they're really, really good. And so I think a lot of the expertise and the networks are migrating away from the public and towards the private, and that's a separate discussion in and of itself. But the implication is that the ideal of a public multilateral agenda-setting platform where these are debated, they exist, but they are not as important as they should be.
Thank you.
What platforms? I think I'm just worried that those who are able to speak at those platforms are not the ones who are really affected. And we spent so much time trying to have local organizations adjust to a system that's not set up for them. You have to go the other way around. I mean, now we have to set up a system that fits the needs on the ground. And then you have to not just look at capitals, but you have to find a way of consulting. And my second point, I'm not so keen on talking about the cuts, but I would like to say something about what you need to keep. Because it's very easy to say, of course, you have to keep the humanitarian assistance, but if you don't do anything about the reasons why you have a humanitarian crisis, we're in trouble. And where we've seen the main reductions over the years, it's on peace work. And now everybody invests in weapons and defense, and all kind of diplomacy and peace work is going down. And then you're just going to end up paying forever.
Thank you. And now to the question of what needs to be cut, or following up on this,
quite
very
good
briefly.
to end, because investing in peace and preventing human suffering, it's morally right, it's economically more efficient. So I hope somebody can raise that cause even stronger. Con mucho gusto. I think NORAD and Mexico actually have a cooperation called Rethinking Development Cooperation. So that's one platform. It's probably not the platform. One other platform, which is often bashed, is the Grand Bargain. So it's sort of a bargain where 25 donors, the UN, the Red Cross, international NGOs, and local NGOs try to come together to make a bargain, how to make the humanitarian system better. Many of the things that people are asking for now are quite similar to what we agreed to do in 2016. Norway has actually done a lot of that. Some others have not. But we believe that's an important platform because it's not a place where only we as donors speak together. Localization, Tale. I mean, it's a bit like prevention. It's a very ethically and economic case to be made. NORAD, we have a pilot to see if we can. We already have direct local partners. And we're having a pilot on humanitarian to see if we can do more of that, if we can support more local-led pooled funds. Of course, one of the main ways Norway does localize or support local actors is through the UN-led country-based pool funds, where we're now probably coming together on a very, very high floor for what the minimum amount of the country-based pool funds can go to local organizations. Did that make sense? So, yeah. There will be probably a commitment to how much of those funds goes to local actors. But again, I feel a bit responsibility to take on the role that if NORAD started to partner more with local organizations, that would be a bureaucratization downstreams asking to set up small bureaucratic systems that maybe are not serving the purpose, including cross-cutting measurements and so forth. So it's an important area to be challenged on, but we don't believe that there's an easy solution to it. We believe Caritas, Norwegian People's Aid, is an excellent way where Norway supports international organizations with good systems who, again, work with local communities, Caritas being present in basically all the countries in the world. So that's one way of doing it. But local is contextual, which is different. And I would like NORAD to be also smaller, meaner, leaner, maybe less reporting. And then there are some costs or downsides coming with that as well.
Yeah. Very briefly, before we have to...
Yeah, too brief. Yeah. On the forums or platforms or whatever, the problem is that all of the arenas or platforms we are talking about are located in Western capitals and heavily shaped by a Western hegemony that does not exist anymore. So none of them are part of the future in which the Western hegemony is something very different, or the West may be different. So that we have a problem there. In terms of cutting and keeping, the key question is what happens if you cut? What else happens if you cut? If you cut aid to reducing climate emissions, somebody will find a way. If you cut aid to medium-income countries, there is a good chance that somehow the same problems can be solved in other ways, by governments or whatever. If you cut aid to people in extreme poverty, nobody else will be there. If you cut humanitarian aid, somebody will die. If you cut aid to sexual and reproductive human rights, probably nothing else. Nobody else will be there. And a lot of minority human rights, there will be nobody else. So that's a key question. I think it's right. If you start with that table, you can start from there and do the politics.
Thank you very concretely. And now, Kristin.
It's easy to be the professor at the end employed by the state. So you asked what to cut, right? So yeah, cut P5s. Make UNHCR only care about its legal protection mandates. push the World Food Programme, UNICEF, IOM, and UNHCR into something in between, the conclave and British Love Island, UK, and have one person exit the house, merge. But literally, we want to reset the humanitarian space. We don't want to lose it. And then we have to have the political will to set an agenda, right? And that's kind of urgent. Thank you.
Yep. On those great words from all of you, thank you so much for taking up this challenge and starting this conversation. It's definitely not the end of it, but I'm very thankful that you all took up this challenge to address these questions together and for a good discussion. And looking forward to other platforms where this discussion will be continued. For us as researchers, this is also affecting our space to do research in different ways, and therefore we're also gathering as researchers tomorrow to discuss through these shocks to the system and also what to do about it as researchers. So just to state that this discussion is also going forward in that forum. Thank you so much everyone for coming, and see you around.